Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin. So one of the questions that comes up from those who are maybe early in the stages of AI adoption is, so if I use OpenAI and share my company data and I'm a paid subscriber or I'm using the API, does that mean that OpenAI or Anthropic can see what I'm doing and read that data and use it for training? And we talked about this before, that if you're a paying customer and you read the fine text, it usually says something like, we do not use your data for training, or the data of paid customers is never used for training our models. And another point that I've made in this respect is that if this were not the case, and we were using models all day, I mean, everyone's using AI models constantly now, that's mopping up so much data that there'd be a scandal probably in a week that something that was ingested in training data leaked. But one question that I don't have a clear-cut answer for, and which I think would be interesting, is sometimes when you're talking to one of these AI bots in a conversational window, or even Claude Code in the terminal, and you might say, you'll get a pop-up that says, how is Claude doing? And you can leave a rating from 1 to 10. So it's a feedback loop. Sometimes the model will say, thanks, I've taken note of your feedback, or something like that. It implies that it's going to be returning some information, and I think that it's something that I think has been trained out of the models a bit, in the sense that if that's not possible and that's incorrect to state that they're not really stating that as much anymore. But back in the early days, they definitely made promises sometimes like, I'll change my behavior, or and there wasn't that memory system in the back of it to actually self-reflect or change going forward. It just was like a pleasant thing to say that I guess in customer service interactions or whatever they've been trained on, that sounded like something that agents might say or customer support people might say it when they've, as a kind of polite way of dealing with a disappointed customer. But it was a fiction. I'd like to chat about the possibilities where this could be more than a fiction, and you'd actually have some mechanism by which an AI agent, let's say there's a pool of millions of people using it every day, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and it potentially could collect a huge amount of feedback if it were safe to do so. And by safe, I mean if the user's data were anonymized, redacted, and maybe some of this could actually percolate up to internal teams for review. So this would be basically a feedback and true feedback process in which when customers give their rating or review or said, this was helpful, you did terribly here. Now, it probably would be a huge challenge from the perspective of vendors to integrate this kind of a fire hose style pipeline, because there'd be so much of it coming in and so much of it maybe just from people who were irate and angry and maybe weren't prompting effectively. That could be it, but there might be some signal in the noise. I'd love to know, Herman and Corin, about any mechanisms along these lines that we've seen to date. I know it's a potential privacy nightmare, but nevertheless, it's an idea that I think has some potential. Have we seen any examples of this in practice? And do you think it's something we might be seeing in the future?
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Korn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem. The sun is just starting to dip behind the limestone buildings of the Givah Shaul neighborhood, casting that golden glow over everything. And I am here with my brother, the man who probably spends more time reading technical white papers and analyzing latent space than he does sleeping.
Herman Poppleberry here. And Korn, that is only a slight exaggeration. Some of those transformer architecture diagrams and reward model loss curves are more beautiful than a sunset over the old city. There is a certain symmetry in the math that you just do not find in nature.
I will take your word for it, Herman. I prefer the sunset. But today, we have a really interesting prompt from a listener named Daniel. It is a question that I think almost every one of us has had while staring at a chat interface late at night. Daniel is asking about the feedback loops in artificial intelligence. You know, those little thumbs up and thumbs down icons we see at the bottom of every single response. Daniel is wondering if that feedback actually goes anywhere, how it is used to refine models in the real world, and what the privacy implications are if our ratings are being used as a massive global mechanism for model improvement.
This is such a timely topic, especially here in February of 2026. We have moved well past the phase where artificial intelligence is just a novelty or a parlor trick. We are in the era of agentic workflows, where these models are actually doing work for us. Because of that, they have to be reliable, they have to be safe, and they have to be helpful in very specific, nuanced ways. The way we tell the model what is good and what is bad, the alignment process is arguably the most important part of the entire development cycle right now.
Right, because there is this persistent feeling, and Daniel touched on this in his prompt, that sometimes when you give feedback, it feels a bit like a placebo. Like you are pushing a button at a crosswalk that is not actually connected to the traffic lights, just there to make you feel like you have agency. But as someone who follows the research and the developer logs, Herman, what is the reality? When I clicked that thumbs down because a model gave me a hallucinated recipe for sourdough, is a developer somewhere actually seeing that?
Well, the short answer is yes, but the long answer is much more complex and, frankly, much more interesting. It is not like there's a customer support agent named Dave in a cubicle who gets an alert on his dashboard every time you are unhappy with a poem or piece of code. The scale is too vast for that. We are talking about billions of interactions a week. Instead, it is a highly automated, systematic process. This is the world of reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF, and its newer cousins like direct preference optimization, or DPO. These are the primary methods used to align large language models with human values, preferences, and factual accuracy.
Okay, let's break that down for the non-engineers. Most of our listeners have heard the term RLHF because it has been the buzzword since ChatGPT first dropped back in late 22. But how does it actually incorporate that live user feedback? Is it a continuous, real-time stream where the model learns from me while I am talking to it?
Not quite. We are not at the stage of continuous learning in the way a human brain works, where every second of experience updates the synapses. Usually, it happens in massive batches. Think of it like a global curriculum design. In the early stages of building a model, what we call the post-training phase, companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, or Google hire thousands of professional annotators. These are often people with advanced degrees in linguistics, philosophy, or computer science. They are shown two different versions of an answer to the same prompt and asked to rank them. Which one is more helpful? Which one is more honest? Which one follows the safety guidelines?
Right. That is the professional phase. The gold standard data. But Daniel is specifically asking about the user phase. The millions of us who are not professional annotators but are using these tools for work and play every day. That is a much larger pool of data than a few thousand hired experts.
Exactly, and that is where the scale gets incredible. When you provide feedback in the app, that data is ingested into massive datasets. But here is the key, your feedback does not usually go directly into the brain of the main model. Instead, it is used to train what is called a reward model. Think of the reward model as a separate, smaller AI whose only job is to act as a judge. It learns to predict what a human would like based on all those thumbs up and thumbs down. Once you have a highly accurate reward model, you can use it to fine-tune the main language model. You basically let the main model practice on millions of prompts in a simulated environment, and the reward model gives it a grade. Over time, the main model learns to generate responses that maximize that grade.
So my single thumbs down is essentially one data point in a sea of millions that helps calibrate the judge, which then teaches the student, which is the language model I actually interact with.
That is a perfect analogy. But Daniel raised a really important point about the promises these models used to make. If you go back to 23 or 24, you would often tell a model it made a mistake, and it would say, "Oh, I am so sorry, I will make sure to remember that and change my behavior in the future."
Yeah, and we all realized pretty quickly that it was a total lie. It had no memory of that conversation once the session ended. If you opened a new window and asked the same thing, it would make the exact same mistake.
Exactly. It was just mimicking a polite customer service representative because it was trained on dialogue where humans say things like that. It was reflecting a persona, not a functional memory. The actual weights of the model, the trillions of numerical values that make up its digital brain, were static. They were frozen in a file on a server. Updating those weights is incredibly expensive. It requires thousands of GPUs running for days or weeks. You cannot do that every time a user gets annoyed.
So, sitting here in early 26, has that changed? Are we getting any closer to a world where my feedback actually influences the model in a more immediate way?
We are seeing two very distinct paths emerging. One is what we call in-context learning, or long context memory. This is where the model uses the current conversation history, which can now be millions of tokens long to adjust its behavior. If you tell a model in the beginning of a session, "I hate bullet points, never use them," the model can hold that instruction in its active memory for the duration of your project. But again, that is not a permanent change to the underlying model. It is just a temporary adjustment.
And the second path?
The second path is what Daniel is hinting at, personalized adapters. This is a huge trend right now. Instead of changing the massive base model for everyone, companies are using low-rank adaptation, or LoRa. Think of it like a little digital backpack that the model wears just for you. This backpack contains a very small set of updated weights that reflect your specific preferences, your writing style, and the feedback you have given over months. When you log in, the base model puts on your specific backpack. So for you, the model actually does learn and evolve.
That is fascinating. So the global model stays the same to ensure stability, but my personal model gets smarter based on my specific thumbs up and thumbs down. But Herman, to make that work on a global scale, where user feedback across the board improves the model for everyone, you run into the massive privacy wall Daniel mentioned. And this is the part of the prompt that I think we really need to dive into. How do you take millions of human conversations, which are full of private details, passwords, medical questions, and personal venting, and turn them into a safe training set without leaking everyone's secrets?
This is the billion-dollar question. If I am using an AI to help me draft a sensitive email to my doctor about a specific condition, and then I give it feedback on how it handled the medical terminology, my private health data is now technically part of that feedback loop. Daniel mentioned anonymization and redaction. In 26, those processes are much more sophisticated than they were 2 years ago, but they are still not perfect.
I imagine it is more than just a find and replace for names and social security numbers.
Oh, much more. There are now automated PII, personally identifiable information, scrubbing pipelines that use specialized models to scan every piece of feedback. They look for addresses, phone numbers, credit card patterns, and even subtle things like specific employer names or unique project titles. But even after you scrub the obvious stuff, you have the problem of linguistic fingerprints.
Linguistic fingerprints? You mean the way I talk can identify me?
Exactly. The specific combination of your vocabulary, your syntax, the obscure topics you happen to know a lot about, and even your common typos can be enough to de-anonymize a dataset if someone is determined enough. This is why the industry has moved towards something called differential privacy.
I have heard that term tossed around in Apple keynotes. How does it actually work in the context of AI feedback?
It is a mathematical framework that adds statistical noise to the data. Imagine you are conducting a survey about something sensitive, like, have you ever cheated on your taxes? If people answer honestly, their privacy is at risk. But if you tell everyone, flip a coin. If it is heads, answer honestly. If it is tails, flip it again and answer yes for heads and no for tails. You now have a data set where you know the percentage of people who cheated on their taxes, but you can never be sure if any single individual's yes was an honest admission or just the result of a coin flip.
That is brilliant. So you get the aggregate truth without the individual exposure.
Exactly. Differential privacy allows AI companies to learn the general patterns. Like users prefer concise explanations of quantum physics, without the system ever knowing. Which specific user asked about quantum physics in their basement in Jerusalem? It allows the model to learn from the crowd, while maintaining a mathematical shield around the individual.
So when Daniel asks if this is a real mechanism, the answer is yes. but it is a mechanism that is filtered through this massive privacy-preserving machine. But let's talk about the fire hose aspect. Daniel mentioned the sheer volume of feedback. Millions of ratings every day. How do they separate the signal from the noise? I mean, I imagine a lot of that feedback is just people being frustrated. Or even worse, people trying to poison the model by giving bad feedback on purpose.
The data poisoning threat is very real. You have trolls who want to make the model more biased, or competitors who might want to degrade a model's performance. If you just fed all feedback into the training loop blindly, the model would collapse. It would become a confident liar because it would learn to prioritize whatever the most vocal or aggressive users want.
So how do they filter for quality?
They use a few layers of defense. First, they look for consensus. If 10,000 different users all give a thumbs down to a specific factual error, say the model claiming that a certain historical event happened in 1924 instead of 1925, that is a very strong signal. One person complaining about a subjective tone issue is a weak signal. Second, they have started using AI feedback on AI feedback or RLHF.
Wait, so an AI is judging the human's judgment of the AI?
Precisely. You take a very high reasoning model, something like the latest O1 or GPT-5 class models, and you ask it to evaluate the user feedback. You ask the judge model, is this user feedback constructive? Does it align with our core safety guidelines? Or is the user simply trying to bypass a filter? This helps categorize the feedback into buckets, factual errors, tone issues, safety refusals, or hallucinations.
It feels a bit like a reputation system. Does my feedback carry more weight if I have a history of being correct in my corrections?
Most companies are very secretive about this because they do not want people gaming the system, but the answer is almost certainly yes. They look for high-quality contributors. If you are a verified expert in a field, let's say you are a known developer on GitHub with a high reputation and you provide feedback on a coding response, the system is likely to weight your input more heavily than a random anonymous user.
Daniel also asked for examples of this in practice. We have seen the thumbs up and down, but have there been moments where a company said, "We changed X because of you"?
The most famous early example was the GPT-4 laziness saga of late 23 and early 24. Users across the world started reporting that the model was refusing to complete long tasks. It would say, you can do the rest yourself or just provide a brief outline instead of the full code. OpenAI actually came out and acknowledged this. They said they had seen the feedback and were working on a fix. That fix involved a new round of fine-tuning specifically designed to counter that lazy behavior. That was a direct public result of the collective voice of the user base.
And what about Anthropic? They have a very different philosophy with their constitutional AI.
Anthropic is a great example of using feedback to refine the constitution itself. Instead of just following what a user wants, because users often want things that are harmful or biased, they use feedback to see where their model's internal rules are being applied too strictly or too loosely. If users are constantly giving a thumbs down because the model is being too preachy about a harmless topic, Anthropic might update the model's instructions on how to handle sensitive topics without being condescending. It is a more principled approach to feedback.
It strikes me that we are moving toward a more democratic way of building these models, but it is a democracy with a lot of gatekeepers.
That is a great way to put it. It is democratic in the sense that the training data, the will of the people, is coming from the masses. But the final decision on what weights get updated and what behaviors are prioritized still rests with the internal teams at these massive corporations. They have to balance your feedback against a dozen other factors: compute costs, legal compliance, safety benchmarks, and performance on standardized tests.
Let's talk about the future part of Daniel's prompt. Do you think we will see more of this? Could we get to a point where a model is truly a living thing that evolves every single day based on what happened the day before?
I think we are headed toward a tiered system. On one level, you will have the massive base models that are updated maybe once or twice a year. These are the foundations. They are too big and too risky to update every day. But on top of that, we are seeing the rise of dynamic knowledge layers. Imagine a model that has a specialized layer for current events that updates every hour by scraping news and user reports. Or a style layer that shifts based on the trending vernacular of the week.
I can see that being incredibly useful, But as a developer, wouldn't that be a nightmare? If I am building an app on top of an AI, I need it to be predictable. If the model changes its behavior every Tuesday because of a bunch of user feedback on Monday, it might break my entire workflow.
That is the model drift problem. It is one of the biggest headaches in the industry right now. When you update a model to make it better at, say, creative writing, you often accidentally make it worse at logic or math. It is like a giant balloon. If you push it in over here to fix a bug, it might bulge out over there and create a new one. This is why companies are so cautious. They have to run massive suites of tests, benchmarks like MMLU or human evil every time they make even a tiny change to ensure they haven't caused a catastrophic forgetting event.
So it is not just about collecting the feedback. It is about the massive infrastructure needed to verify that the feedback actually made the model better without breaking its brain.
Exactly. And Daniel's point about internal teams using this data is key. The feedback is not just for the model, it is for the researchers. They look at the clusters of negative feedback. If they see a huge spike in negative ratings around, say, the model's ability to understand sarcasm in Arabic, they realize they have a data gap. They might then go out and specifically hire more Arabic-speaking annotators or buy more high-quality Arabic datasets to fill that hole in the next version.
It is almost like we, the users, are the world's largest quality assurance team.
That is exactly what we are. We are all unpaid beta testers for the most complex software ever written. Every time you click that thumbs down, you are performing a tiny act of digital labor that helps shape the future of intelligence.
When you put it that way, it makes me want to be a bit more thoughtful with my feedback. I am not just venting my frustration at a machine. I am contributing to the evolution of a digital mind.
You really are. And that brings up a practical takeaway for Daniel and everyone else. If you want the models to get better, the best thing you can do is provide modus-specific feedback. A simple thumbs down is a weak signal, but most interfaces now allow you to type a reason. If you say, this answer was factually correct, but the tone was too condescending, or you missed the third constraint I gave you in the prompt, that is gold for a researcher. It is much more actionable than just, I did not like this.
That is a great tip. If we want these tools to serve us better, we have to be better at communicating what we actually want. It is a two-way street.
And we have to be patient. The path from your feedback to a global model update is long. It has to go through redaction, anonymization, reward model training, fine-tuning, and then weeks of safety and performance testing. It is a slow, deliberate process, as it should be when you are dealing with something this powerful.
We have covered a lot of ground here, Herman. From the technical side of RLHF and DPO to the privacy challenges of PII and differential privacy. It seems like Daniel's intuition was right on the money. This feedback is a real mechanism, but it is hidden behind several layers of sophisticated processing.
It is. And I think in the next year or two, we are going to see much more transparency around this. We might see features where a model says, hey, I noticed several people found my previous explanation of this concept confusing, so I have been updated to be more clear. That kind of closing of the loop would build a lot of trust.
I agree. Right now, it feels like a one-way street where we send our data into a black hole and hope for the best. Seeing the results of that collective feedback would be a huge step forward for the industry.
Definitely. It would also help educate users on what constitutes good feedback. If you see how the model improves based on certain types of input, you are more likely to stay engaged with the process.
Well, I think we have given Daniel a lot to chew on. It is a complex system, but at its heart, it is about trying to make technology more human by actually listening to humans.
Well said, Korn. It is the ultimate collaboration between our messy, intuitive human preferences and the rigid, logical world of machine learning. It is where the weirdness of our prompts meets the weirdness of how these models learn.
Before we wrap up, I want to remind everyone that if you are finding these deep dives helpful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It really does help the show grow and helps other people find these conversations.
Yeah, we love seeing those reviews. It is our own little feedback loop, right? We read them, we learn from them, and we try to make the next episode better.
Exactly. We are using human feedback to improve our own model here. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com, where we have all our past episodes and a contact form if you want to get in touch. We are also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you get your audio fix.
And if you have a prompt of your own, something that made you go, or something you were curious about in the world of AI, you can send it to show@myweirdprompts.com. We are always looking for new ideas to explore.
Thanks to Daniel for this one. It was a great excuse to dig into the mechanics of how these models actually learn from us. It is easy to forget that there is a massive infrastructure behind those two little icons.
Always a pleasure. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We will talk to you in the next one. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.